Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a doctoral student in psychology, and with me today is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover on the show, feel free to email us at fromnowheretonothingpodcast@gmail.com or contact us on our Facebook page. If you subscribe to this show, and know that we appreciate you if you do, you spend an hour each week listening to us talk about a wide range of topics. You certainly don't agree with everything we say, but you find the show intriguing enough to continue listening each week. Have you ever asked yourself why that is? Do you find the majority of our discussions to be rational and get at the truth of the subjects we cover? Or do you find that the idiosyncratic way we narrate our journey through a topic makes it seem more meaningful and more entertaining than other ways of engaging with it? Today, we'll look at that question by examining Fisher's narrative paradigm.
That was a very nice lead in, because it is cool that people subscribe.
Yeah.
It's not like we ever started out for that to happen. And it's very humbling. I mean, we do have people listening and we talk to each other because we're having the conversation, but I'm thinking of, this disembodied, embodying faces, or, trying to, imagine sitting in a living room and having a few people on it, and we're sipping coffee, tea, or whatever, and we're talking. And one of the podcasts you were on said, "What are you drinking?" Right?
Yeah.
A nice cold glass of water right now. But it is cool, and people are starting to ask for topics.
Yeah, this one was also a listener request from Cassie. So thanks for suggesting it, and hopefully we don't go too harsh on the topic. But as you'll find, it's a very nuanced thing, and there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. But yeah, going back to the intro, right? Really, podcasting, and not just our show, but podcasts in general, sort of typify this idea of a narrative paradigm, right? Because I've listened to some shows that are quite technical in nature, and actually, philosophy podcasts in general tend to be that way.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you listen to Philosophy Bites, or what was the other one? There's it's right on the tip of my tongue. But anyways, they tend to be, they're going to cite sources, and they're going to almost read from a textbook of philosophy.
Yeah. So
it's very educational in nature.
Yeah.
But they tend not to be as engaging, right? It's usually one person. There's no back and forth. There's nothing like that. But a lot of the podcasts that people enjoy are ones where there's a discussion happening, and people might not necessarily be citing sources or doing anything like that. Really what they're doing, right, is telling stories. And you and I do that week in and week out. We talk about our own experiences, the experiences of people we know.
Yeah.
And even, tell stories about the specific subjects that we're talking about. So yeah, this idea is certainly relevant. So we'll start at the beginning. Do you want to give us a background on Walter Fisher, who developed the paradigm?
Yeah. And he died not too many years ago. He was a scholar, academic, taught at the University of California. I forget which is part of the institution. A lot of street cred as a teacher of discourse and rhetoric, and developed this idea that he took pains to explain was not a theory. Not that he eschewed theories. Theories are important because they help structure how we what we make of the world. But he called it a narrative paradigm. It is really a kind of theory, but he wanted to emphasize the idea of paradigm. And the kernel of it is that human storytelling, we're natural storytellers, but we aren't naturally rational. And of course, this sets some people off, but that sat well with me, that part of it, years ago, because when one studies logic and teaches logic, and you read what logicians talk about, one of the main things that most textbooks and writers of logic say is that it is difficult for people because it is not natural. We don't generally make formal logical arguments in order to convince someone of something. But we think we're being rational when we're trying to convince someone of something. And we don't even separate the idea that argument and persuasion are not the same things. And so here's Fisher saying, opening that can of worms, so to speak, that metaphor, and saying, okay, really, rationality does not work all that well for humans when they're trying to communicate something and get somebody to do something. In essence, persuade somebody to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, like reading anything by, like, if Socrates is a good example, right? Where he'll go through a Socratic method. And so what I find is, like, lots of times when you're reading some of his stuff, his enemy will propose something, right? And you'll go, okay, yeah, that seems to make sense, right?
Yeah, Plato says
and then question by question, all of a sudden you start to realize, oh, actually this thing that on face value seemed to be pretty intuitive, all of a sudden you start picking it apart and you go, oh, nope, now you can't deny that it doesn't work, right? And so I think that highlights how rationality is not inherent to the human mind.
Yeah. We don't do syllogistic thinking in nice steps.
Right. Not naturally.
Not natural. We can certainly do it. We learn to do it. We can develop ourselves to do it.
Yeah.
But then Fisher goes, he's and this is in 1987 when his book comes out. He's trying to apply this to the public sphere, to politics, to social issues at that time, on how people were conceiving of them, and saying that a good story is more convincing than anything else. But when you get deeper into it, you realize that narrative is not just storytelling. This is where, for me, the problem with overarching paradigms or theories in composition, which is to say writing or in speaking, if it becomes so large as to umbrella most everything, then I think lots of things become really ambiguous, and it's not so helpful.
Yeah. And so, just for the listener's sake, a paradigm versus a theory, right? A theory is an idea about how something works, and a paradigm usually has a family of theories within it, right? It's the next level up. It's something that is sort of all encompassing for a way
of looking at something, and that way of looking at something has been put together by clusters of theories.
Yeah. And so what Fisher is saying is right, is that the narrative paradigm is essentially that humans, this is influences the way that we think about everything is in story, right?
Yeah.
So should we say more about narrative paradigm, or do we want to?
I think we'll just keep recursively. We'll keep returning to it, because I don't want to turn this into an academic lecture.
Yeah.
Because I don't think, probably, was it Cassie who asked to talk about this? May well have wanted that. I don't know. So we're sort of treading both sides of the path.
All right. So, well, let's talk about how it contrasts with the rational world paradigm, which is sort of, the typical way that we think about how humans thought since the ancient Greeks, right?
Well, let's see. Just to simplify to the point of ridiculousness, I suppose. So the rational world approach is to say we see things, we make determinations about those things, we make causal associations with things, and in so doing, we extend our lives. We often go to this. I don't know how we got into this Fred Flintstone kind of cave person thing, but the cave guy or a woman, or that they go out and, well, okay, I'm going to back up. Minions, because that's like wonderful. Yeah. Here are the minions bouncing along, and they're helping a caveman, and he's facing a bear, and he's about to raise his club at the bear, and the minions are no, and hand him a fly swatter, and then point to the bear, and so he swats the bear's nose. And then, of course, he's consumed. So the rational world would say that little story is ridiculous. What happens is you see what a bear does. You see how large it is. You choose a weapon if you're going to have to encounter the bear. And I mean, that's one goofy example, but you take the evidence of your senses and you try to logically follow through. If then, what if, then I should, and those kind of things.
Yeah. So that's a fun illustration. And I think that it helps us get to the heart of what this discussion is going to be about, right? Which is sort of like what I was just saying with any Socratic story, right? Here we have two opposing views. And when you are first introduced to them, they both seem to have a lot of merit, right? The one is, the rational world paradigm, which says humans are inherently rational, right? We see cause and effect. We're able to, draw conclusions about the way things work, and we use logical syllogisms to arrive at knowledge and to make decisions.
Yeah.
And then we have Fisher, who's advocating a narrative paradigm, which he sort of built in direct opposition to the rational world paradigm. He said, no. Humans are not inherently rational. What we do inherently is we tell stories, and then we integrate these stories across individuals in different contexts to create narratives on a large level, based on culture or religion or any other sort of thing. And every way that we communicate is a story in some way. It has a setting, it has characters, it has a beginning and an end, and these sorts of things. So both positions, when you lay out the basics of them that way, you go, oh, well, they both seem pretty logical, right?
Yes,
and so we'll sort of dig into the narrative paradigm a little bit and see if we can uncover which one is closer to the truth, or if trying to make that sort of determination is really fallacious in its attempts.
I know where I'm going to land.
So what components make up the criterion for good narrative? And what was Fisher sort of positing with his theory?
Well, among other things, as you would expect, and as you just mentioned a moment ago, that in storytelling we have subcategories of reasons that we tell stories, and stories that emerge from different kinds of contexts. So we have stories that are implied or told, and we'll get to that part too, because we're not always talking about telling a story beginning to end. About tragedy, crisis, or great sorrow brought about by some large event. We have stories that are intimate stories about things that happen to one person, but in finding out about that, more knowledge is supposedly extended. We have humorous stories, the point being to entertain. We have stories primarily to persuade. We have stories that are mostly to inform. And some people would argue that advertisements for pharmaceuticals in doctors' offices, right? Is the classic example. And that yes, it's supposed to entertain you, keep your eyes on the screen, but it's telling you things that you need to know about a certain medication. But even that, that can be deconstructed too. Then why do they tell us all the bad stuff really rapidly, really fast in small print at the end? We'll get to that kind of analysis. But so the purpose of the story is something that has to be sussed out. And then are there characters? Is there a story arc? Is there something being implied or something being stated? Is there a good guy and a bad guy? Is there what's the structure that is being given to us?
Yeah, and then on top of that, in order to, because rationality, right? It's empirical, right? It appears to be objective, right? You can say A plus B equals C. Well, if you take a narrative paradigm approach, trying to determine what works, right, is you have to come up with a whole new set of principles, right? And Fisher sort of posited coherence and fidelity
Yes.
As those two principles. Coherence being how much a story sort of makes sense with itself, and then fidelity, how much it makes sense in terms of the other stories that we encounter, right? So your example of the bear and the minions and the fly swatter earlier, right? That story lacks coherence, right? Because A, minions are not real, right? And B, a caveman would not have had access to a plastic fly swatter, right? So the story is incoherent, right? And then the fidelity of the story, right? It might have fidelity based on the context, right? If you are watching a children's movie, then maybe it has some fidelity with that story arc, right? Provided that the caveman doesn't get eaten to pieces, maybe he gets bopped on the head or something, right? There's some comic violence, but in terms of something real that we would see if we were to leave the studio here and walk outside the house, well, then it doesn't have fidelity, right?
No.
So do you want to kind of explore those concepts a little further?
I would like to, and I will step carefully, but speaking in general terms, this is where, on the surface of it, the Fisher narrative paradigm starts to fall apart for me, but not entirely. I mean, I am not going to bash somebody who's developed over a lifetime an idea that helps us rethink and talk about communication, because and the value is there in itself. But the problem is that what we take as truth, which would be coherence with our own worldview or coherence with what we think we have experienced, that's where it gets really dicey. And without getting too specific, that's what our political situation is in the United States now, undeniably. So that a story will be told, and Fisher mentions this too, the repetition of a story enhances its believability to human beings who encounter it. So you say enough times, an election was stolen, then people just start to accept it as, well, it must be so, because otherwise, why would they say it so much? That's where it falls apart. That's what demonstrates the lack of rationality or the lack of logic. But the narrative paradigm isn't trying to be judgmental in that way. It's just saying, but look, it works.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that this is where it gets kind of interesting, right? Because so when I look at Fisher's conception of coherence and fidelity, coming from a background of, somebody who's working on a PhD in psychology, right? So I'm working on being a social scientist, right? The two things that are important to scientific endeavor are internal validity, right? Which is making sure that something makes sense in the way it works. And then external validity, which means making sure that that thing also works with the broader context, ecological validity.
Right. Good.
And so,
I'm not trying to intrude in. I want you to keep going. But to go back to the minions thing, this is not a minions ad, but it's just within the story, it's consistent. How the minions arose is established. We see a long arc of brief, but of across time of how they've developed their purpose of serving the greatest evil. So there's an internal coherence, totally out of sync.
Yeah. No, exactly. And a lot of fiction does work that way, right? Fiction only works if you have good internal validity. If the story structure makes sense and causes, viewers or readers or listeners or whatever type of media you're using to, put aside the outside world and say the story makes sense here, right? And so I think that the narrative paradigm, Fisher's narrative paradigm, scores highly on internal validity, right? Coherence and fidelity are very good at establishing internal validity, at finding a story arc, identifying a setting and characters, motivations, consistency, that sort of thing. But there really isn't much mention made of external validity. And external validity, the idea of how you take a story and then put that story within the context of reality of the world we live in, right? That was something that from what I've read has not been fleshed out as completely, and it's very important, right? Because if you have, I think we've all come across conspiracy theories with high degrees of internal validity, right? Moon landings or flat Earth or this sort of thing, where people have crafted very intricate stories, that have a compelling narrative. They have all of the setting and the characters and the details and everything.
People love conspiracy theories,
right?
Because the human being wants to believe that it's that human being against the world is what everybody's. Because there's a psychological truth embedded in this, which is that people want to think they are more important than they are in the scheme of things. We all want to think that. I think that's a universal.
Yeah.
And so this is not bashing. This is just looking at human nature. Well, of course the government is watching me because, okay, slow down. Think about your daily life. What could possibly be of use? That doesn't mean you're an insignificant person. It means that your daily life is not significant to power brokers.
Right.
Which is why stories that aren't true can reach people, because those stories are set up to say, but you are very important. Well, of course, every human being on this planet is important, and every human being who dies is a loss to our collective humanity. But that sounds too academic to say, right? That sounds too cyclical. Well, I'm being dry in saying that. But if I whip up a tail, so I didn't mean to.
No. Yeah. So that's one part of it, right? But the other part of it that I think is very interesting, and this is where I don't know what Cassie's feelings are on Fisher's narrative paradigm, right? She just said, hey, I want you guys to talk about this.
I hope that Cassie will write back and talk to us about this.
Yeah, I hope so too. But so I don't know if this is going to be sort of saving the episode if she was in favor of it, or playing devil's advocate if she wasn't. But either way, right? That's besides the point. Philosophy is looking at ideas critically and trying to find what the validity in them is. So where I sort of find this interesting is in what we've highlighted is, okay, so here's the weaknesses in Fisher's paradigm, but we have not established that it does not work. As a matter of fact, I think that the developments on the world stage that have taken place since Fisher posited the paradigm tend to support the notion that this is the way people think and this is the way that they operate, not rationally and with a good story.
Right? With a good story. Now, your point about externalism is, I felt that too. I didn't use it in those terms, but when I think about it in terms of common sense, which is a bizarre concept in itself. Because the very nature of saying, well, it's common sense means, well, it's common sense within the paradigm of my life experience. It's like being in a black hole and having a whole universe. It's, but what's common sense for me in my lived experience may not be common sense for somebody living 2 doors down.
Yeah, it's funny. I actually read an article that was unrelated to this earlier in the week that was talking about how I think the title of it might have been Common Sense Isn't So Common. And that's what they were talking about, was the idea of common sense is sort of a fallacy, because what sense is common to people is dependent on their narrative, on their life narrative, on what their experiences have been.
And as I understand it, or have over decades think that I've come to understand some of it, as a practicing teacher of composition and so on, just from that viewpoint, or just living. Fisher asserts that common sense is the assessment tool for narrative coherence and fidelity. But I think that puts an awful lot of pressure on the very thing that the paradigm pushes against, which is common sense is implying a rationality and a logic that's not necessarily there. I'm referencing that I said to you off mic earlier this morning. I'll just simply shorthand it. Oh, the government has weather machines. That explains what's going on.
Right.
And I can assert that may be a common view among a group of conspiracy theorists who'd rather believe that the government has power to control the weather than believe that there's a climate crisis. But there's not. There may be a common missense or common sense within the self-generated story pool, but it's not a good metric for measuring coherence.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of damage done. We're just starting to realize this, right? And a lot of lay people don't know it, but I think a lot of lay people think that we have a pretty consistent measure of IQ, right? Intelligence. But what we're starting to discover is the intelligence tests that were created by psychologists in the 60s and 70s were all based on middle class white people's knowledge, right? And so what happens is if you apply this IQ test to people of different races and cultures and ethnicities and things across the world, those people don't score well because they're not middle class white people. But that doesn't mean that they're less intelligent. So our test that was developed to identify intelligence does not work because what we considered common sense, right? What we considered to be measuring this thing wasn't actually measuring it. And I think that you're right. That's sort of the problem with the narrative paradigm is when you put all of the emphasis on rationality on the person interpreting the story. You can look at it in a positive light, right? And say it democratizes it, right? Okay, well, we're no longer relying on elite, qualified, educators
right.
and politicians and academics who are dictating policy to us because they're using an obscure rationality to interpret what's true
Which
and what's
is itself
real.
A conspiracy theory.
Now, anybody can recognize a good story, so we're all responsible for identifying it, right?
Oh, that's the positive view.
That's the positive view, right? And so the intelligence test reinforces that, right? Okay, well, the academics and the scholars and these people came out with a test to measure intelligence, but they based it off of the wrong criteria, and so everybody, assumed that this intelligence score was measuring something that it was not measuring.
And so that also is a still in the benign area, but this stuff can be weaponized and is weaponized,
right?
With imperialistic intent, with social casting intent, whatever labels one wants to put to it. Okay. So naturally, this measures the thing that's common sense to us, and therefore, we'll keep using it. But the people who say no, it doesn't do that. We have to back up, and then they're trying to push against this enormous landslide of accepted belief. That's really hard to do.
Yeah.
Even when you tell a story.
Right. So, but the negative side of this, right, is that by democratizing truth in essence, right, the ability to recognize some, what's being said, people come up with their own stories, and these stories don't match with other people's stories. And one of the academic articles I was reading in preparation for this identified this. They said, really, this wasn't as much of a problem in the past because individual stories tended to mesh it with other individual stories into meta narratives, right? That were either encompassed in religious organizations, political organizations, those sorts of things. I said in modernity, right? With everybody's different access to technology and different abilities to, interact with other people. This is sort of falling apart, right? These central organizations, the church, the government, academia, right? These organizations, power has
knowledge,
as weakened, has been discredited in place of people's own internal stories, and the author of this study, who was espousing actually narrative paradigm, said that this is negative, and they called it emotivism. Emotivism is when you are basing what's true off of your own individual stories that are based off of your own individual emotions.
Yes.
And they said that I mean, at that point, you're just you're unrooted. You don't have any solid foundation.
Self-referential, and you're floating. Foucault talked about this, about the shifting of knowledge and power across patriarchies, across time and history, so that one truth doesn't exist for a culture because the culture is manufactured with that. That truth might be. So, okay.
Yeah, and Foucault was brought up quite a bit. But you see, now we're in the thick of it, right? So we've demonstrated, right? We've demonstrated ways in which the rational world paradigm has failed us, right? And there's many examples, right? We can all think of ways that political organizations and religious organizations and academic organizations have failed us, right? Or have made a wrong decision. But we've also identified a lot of more than surface weaknesses in the narrative paradigm, right? Some very structural things that appear to be problematic.
Let's do a kind of Socratic thing. Okay. What's a movie that you've watched in your recent history that you liked?
I've watched Interstellar every 6 months.
Okay. And I love Interstellar too. It's not necessarily because of the actor, but he's cool.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. All right. Is it a true story?
No.
Push back.
Well, you see, it's contextual, right? Because the physics of it is done very well enough to the point where there was scientific papers written on the way that some of it was done. But the narrative itself is concocted.
Right. So you can tell the difference then between a fictionalized story and a story that is meant to tell the truth. So you would assert that you know the difference between a made-up story and a real story.
I would like to assert that. Yeah.
Yeah. So would I. But there ends the Socratic. I think that's the essence of it. I think that narrative with good intent, but I think that it because people know the difference between an Avengers movie or Star Trek film or Interstellar or whatever, and life. Did that really happen? No, not yet. It's in the future, or whatever. But the assumption being that because we can determine that, we can always determine when something is consistent and therefore truthful or not. Because fiction is more complicated than that. When you try to make everything stories, it really drags out the notion of story. We were talking before the show about icons, about logos for companies, and whole branches of of economic practice. Well, a good logo will tell a story of your company. A logo doesn't tell a story. A logo implies the possibilities of story that the person who sees the logo then makes up. Because even if an internal memo tells everyone, by gods, this is the story, and you're going to put this out in public, this is the story of our company, that's not the same thing as what somebody looks at a logo, and many people would say, I look at a logo, I don't make anything of it at all. And the advertisers would say, well, then it's a weak logo. But if you're supposed to be deconstructing or interpreting or analyzing the essence of an image, and it's a really good exercise to do, and it's what we do when we look at art and all of the humanities, but to assert that is a story, that's where this falls apart to me.
Yeah, and I think that Fisher's retort would be that it is a story, but the meaning of the story is determined by the one who is hearing it, not the one who's telling.
Fair point. I think you would. Yes.
Yeah. And this is, I think that this sort of gets at the heart of, because Interstellar, right? When you asked me, is it a true story? Right. And I sort of hesitated because is the true story about Cooper and his jaunts all over the universe? No, that's obviously fictionalized. But is it possibly a story about how relativistic gravity works, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of is, right? And so each narrative has a story, has multiple stories inside of it. And some of them can be true and some of them can be false.
Is it true to fatherhood? Well, that would depend on one's own experience on either end of that particular spectrum. But if it's true enough to bring tears to the eyes of people, there's an emotional truth.
Yeah.
That speaks somehow, whether it's unconsciously or consciously. It says, it resonates. It hits that point where you can explode the wall and get inside. We were talking about the sound thing this morning, right? You get to a certain point with your sound you make or your voice or whatever, and systems change. I think that's the measure of a truth.
Yeah. And so here we get into the big stuff, right? And so this is the question I've been waiting to ask all episode, right? We know, if we go back to human Kant, right? Espousing empiricism versus rationality, right? Empiricism is looked at as the objective and rationality as the subjective. In this discussion, we've sort of looked at rationality in the context of the rational world paradigm as being more objective or empirical, and the narrative as being the more subjective. But within Fisher's paradigm, they discuss the narrative rationality. We need a definition of rationality, right, that can give us some criteria for determining if one or the other of these theories is valid, right? So what is rationality in terms of what we're talking about?
Well, Fisher says the narrative rationality is how effectively the story communicates, how effectively the story touches you. If you emerge from the movie and I got nothing, then it didn't have narrative rationality. If you emerge, but even this implies that people will come out from a movie and say more than, "Oh, love the special effect. Yeah, that was great. It was great when they jumped off the mountain and fell," or come out from a movie and say, in an Indiana Jones film, that guy's dead. Nope, he's dead. Nope, he can't come back later on. He's dead because the physics just doesn't work. Well, then the narrative rationality has not functioned. But I think that's a narrow, probably necessarily narrow definition by example or by assumption.
Yeah, I think this is a good example, right? And this is why I love philosophy, right? Yep. We've used rationality throughout the conversation as if we know what it is, right? But it's very difficult, and rationality will mean different things in different contexts. Right?
Well, and then there's narrative emotion, and I sort of cross the boundaries of the two. I sort of pushed them together when I shouldn't have.
Well, and I think even the dictionary definition, right? The quality of being based on or in accordance with reason or logic. Well, reason or logic are two different things, right?
Yes,
I think that logic espouses what we've been talking about, syllogisms and the philosophical discipline of logic. Whereas, rationality or reason is basically just what we've been talking. Reason is the internal validity that we've been talking about, right? The ability of a story to make sense within itself. Whereas logic is something a bit different, right? And so this idea of rationality, right? And trying to posit the rational world paradigm as being diametrically opposed from narrative's Fisher paradigm. Well, it's really taking liberties with what we're considering rational. And so
sensible.
Yeah. And so I think that And what we've discovered by looking at the world, right, is that, okay, well, there are certain contexts in which a rational world paradigm works. And then there's certain contexts where a narrative paradigm, if it works, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you were hitting on it there just a second ago when you were saying coming out of the movie, right? How you feel coming out of the movie. That's sort of the rational, narrative rationality, right? Regardless of what the truth is outside of the story, if the story is convincing enough and the story evokes emotions, then it is rational in that context, right?
It's internally consistent. But your point about is well taken about logic and reasoning. Reasoning is sometimes they're used interchangeably, but there is a difference, and reasoning usually sooner or later appeals to sense, which is itself a difficult word, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have 5 senses. Which one are we talking about? That's not what I mean by sense. What do you mean by sense? All right. Sense would be what? What do we mean? Ordinary, assumed knowledge? It's ordinary. If your mind is calibrated and balanced, all right, then of course you would see the sense of this. Why? I mean, I'm trying to be inclusive enough with this to not just bash on a group of people, right? We all are capable of being insensible or without our senses. He's out of his mind. Like all the phrases that we use. But if it makes sense, that means things have clumped together somehow. The tumblers have tumbled, and the vault door is going to open. If it makes sense, what one must do next, and I don't see that in the paradigm. What must do next is to say, why?
Yeah.
Should I trust that this really is sensible just because I want to believe it? Does it really have anything to do with my lived experience? I want to believe that the government is totally rotten and is totally it's after me. Give me 3 examples of where the government was after you. I want to believe that we're being overrun with people. Okay, then you don't want to believe that less than 1% of the people in this country are immigrants illegally. But it takes, what does it take to slow down, to stop, to be able to say, I'm examining this? There are all kinds of reasons, and I'm not trying to offer justifications that people won't. They're tired. They're angry because they've been whipped up into being angry. They have a grudge because life hasn't done for them what they thought was going to do. Any number of reasons. They're tired because they have 3 jobs and they shouldn't have to have 3 jobs, and.
Yeah, I think that you've gotten us there with that example of asking the why, right? Because I'm going to posit something and I'll see what your reaction to it is. Up to this point in the conversation, we have taken the sort of default stance that Fisher's narrative paradigm and the rational world paradigm are diametrically opposed, and that one of them tells us the truth about the world. And then throughout our discussion, we've seen faults in both of them, right? Which would lead us to believe that it's probably not the case that either one is correct, right? So now we're taking on a type of Hegelian dialectic.
Hegelian stuff. Hegelian stuff.
So here's my dialectic proposition, right? Rationality, as espoused by the rational world paradigm, is not inherent to people. So I agree with Fisher's narrative paradigm there. But I would posit that rationality in the rational world paradigm is the most beneficial way to address communications on a paradigmatic level. Fisher's narrative paradigm is the natural form of human communication, but it should only apply on a theoretical level to contextual situations and not on a paradigmatic level to human communication as a whole. What do you think of that?
I rapidly.
That's a lot.
No, I think that holds water, so to speak. But that's because I want to believe in rationality, but I also love the power of story. Right? So I think you're addressing both of those things. And I think that the idea that one must be always in the ascendant over the other, that's the part that you're not asserting, but that's the part that bothers me when we say, well, this paradigm explains better how things happen. There are times when stories are absolutely necessary. And there are times, and people always, we're constantly narrating our own story. You can go home and tell a friend, a partner, I dropped my keys. I lost my keys. Or you go home and say, I was coming back from the store and I got out of the car and I realized that I don't know where my keys are, but I had the keys when I came home. And so they must be, now we're narrating a whole process and just saying, instead of saying, I lost my keys.
Yeah.
I lost my keys gets us there.
Right.
But if you're trying to figure out where the keys are and you tell a story, then you start backtracking. You do the Sherlock Holmes thing. If everything else is eliminated, which is rational and logical, then what remains must be the truth.
Yeah. No. Yeah. So, and I'll give an article to people if they want to read an academic article on this, because it was very interesting. When I went to look at a lot of the academic literature, a lot of it was critical of Fisher's narrative paradigm. Yeah. But this one I liked because it attempted to do what we're doing here, which is to seed it within human context and to find the things that are worthwhile about it. But the name of the article was Texturing the Narrative Paradigm,
I read that.
Folklore and Communication by Kathleen Glenister Roberts.
Yeah.
And the one sort of quote that really stuck out to me, I'll see if I can find it, was at the end. But she basically said, we're not, basically not bashing the paradigm, right? No. But trying to contextualize it within what we know about communication. And she said exactly what you were just saying, which is folklore, right? Our stories about ourselves do have important ways of influencing our thinking and are important, right?
Mm-hmm. But we have to have a rational underpinning for that.
Yes. And so she referred to us as living in a post-virtue world, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so I think this is where it's beneficial to go back to the Greeks, right? And think about when the Greek philosophers were talking about living the good life, right? What were they saying? It was this espousal of rationality over just our emotivism, mm-hmm. our just engaging in our own emotions, our own personal story, and then elevating that to the level of truth, right? It was about going beyond that and actually confronting the facts of the matter and coming and doing the hard work of logically determining what is going on, and sometimes having to give up your initial position and accept what is actually happening.
This is where populism. This is precisely the point where populism, in any place and time, when it's when the story supersedes documented truth, when the story supersedes what is or has been, to go into an entire world of fiction, that causes harm and pain to lots of people. And the very population that believes in it is the population that's going to end up getting hurt most. So there's that. Then there's also, we need to, I think it's important to point out that one of the other influences of the many, because he was a scholar, so endless influences on somebody coming to terms with how he's seeing the world. Kenneth Burke a fascinating writer, thinker, philosopher, educator, developed a thing of a theory of dramatism, and Fisher drew upon that. And not surprisingly, Burke's dramatism was the idea that we essentially see ourselves as players on a stage. As you go back to Shakespeare's "All the World's a Stage," and dramatism works with that. Okay, but on that stage, where is the human motivation? Why are people doing what they're doing? Why are they doing it? How they're doing it? And so on. It requires that thought. So it's not just the storytelling implied in a symbol or told all the way through, but it's the intention and the motivation that a more dramatistic view brings that I think is important.
Yeah, and again, it's this idea of, we've talked about meaning on the podcast a lot, and how meaning is ultimately, it seems to be more a subjective thing than an objective thing, right? It's hard to look out into the universe and find meaning, but what we ascribe meaning from our subjective point of view is real to us. But that's not necessarily the same with truth, right? And I think that is where it becomes easier to contextualize when to use narrative paradigm versus when to use rational paradigm.
I agree. And I think that, to be fair to Fisher, there's also this other element that I haven't really pointed to. And I guess it's more of a way of seeing it. I think Fisher himself says that he's not trying to attack or diminish people's view. When he says people are not primarily logical, he's not saying people are stupid. He's saying that logic does not, and formalistic reasoning does not allow many people to be able to express what's important to them, or begin to think about why. And there's the dramatistic part. And whereas if we took people's stories more seriously, or with more intention, that can lead to then a more reasonable discussion. It's not just tell my story and there it is, and it doesn't matter what anybody says. Tell my story, I'm listening, and it's rather the classic listening theory, right? Okay, what I hear you saying is, and people don't even like to hear that anymore because that's become almost mimic, but really, all right, you're angry. Why are you angry? Or you feel like you have been forgotten. What is your story telling me about why you feel like you've been forgotten? What has been forgotten that needs to be remembered? And if those kind of conversations happened, I think there'd be a lot less political anger. But that also goes back to the ideal of, we rationally talked about it after you told your story.
Yeah. I think that there is a lot of positive potential for narrative paradigm that we did not give its due diligence during the show. And I think it can be bottom up, like for what you were just saying. I think it can also be top down. I think that's where a lot of important implications for it could be, right?
Yeah.
Which is the ability of politicians and academics and business leaders to express information, to tell a story, to make it meaningful to the people under them. And I've noticed that from being a business leader, right, that's when I'm the most successful as a communicator, right? Is not when I'm saying, hey, do this because I said so, but saying, hey, listen, a customer came in, they said that this is their priority of focus. In order to address that, we have to look at this thing. Now tell me what your experience of work is that comes into conflict with that. And then let's come up with a new thing that addresses it, right?
Yeah.
I think that if you have a story, you have a narrative, and a narrative from the customer side, a narrative from my side, a narrative from the employee side, and then a narrative about how we're going to work as a team. It's much more effective than just laying out the rational facts and expecting people to abide by them.
Yes. Yeah.
So last question, because it's a disease and I can't help myself. Do stories exist, or is it just the way our brains have developed to make meaning?
Oh, stories exist. We have them. Stories exist. The library is filled with them.
I guess the question would be, do we have stories, or do stories have us?
Right? Okay, now you're getting into logology. You did that on purpose, didn't you? At the end, right. Which is the study of words of language, and sometimes it has theological intent, but it's much broader than that. Logology is the study of words and how words shape reality. So the stories have us.
Yeah.
And I'll say this just because I love to be inflammatory. This is why the classic statement: if God didn't exist, we'd have had to invent God. There would be we would need to have invented those stories that some people assert. Language has us right there. Language has us all the time because we can't even figure what's sense. Well, sense means this, but sense also means this. But I know what I mean by when I'm saying sense, don't you? You sort of get it, right? And maybe you can be you're being nice and say, yeah, I get it. And underneath, you're saying, nope, nah. But you wouldn't do that. You'd push back. Language has us. I love the way you phrase that. It does.
Yeah, I think that it's pretty clear cut, right? I think that what's the best way to look at it is to look at everything, right? If we look at everything, we can say, okay, well, the universe is a setting. It had a beginning. It's likely it will have an end, and it has characters. Mm-hmm. So I think that story has us. I think it's pretty clear cut.
I agree. Bravo.
All right. Until next time, keep pondering.